My colleague Rochelle Akufo spoke to Jharonne Martis. She's the Director of Consumer Research at Refinitiv. Rochelle first asked her which companies are most impacted by the pandemic.
Well, when you look at the retail index, over 200 companies that Refinitiv covers, over 50% are expected to see a decline, negative earnings and negative same-store sales for the first quarter of the year. Now, the companies that are most vulnerable are definitely department stores, because even before the pandemic, they were already suffering from weak mall traffic. So other stores are also very vulnerable. But when you look at the department stores, they're expected to post the weakest decline in earnings of over 300%. And when you combine that with our StarMine Smart Ratios model, it tells us that these companies are not only expected to post weak numbers, but also are in danger of default. And obviously, the longer the pandemic lasts, the worse their probability of default will get.
Now, some people have argued that, look, part of the reason that some of these department stores are failing is because they didn't adapt quite as quickly to e-commerce. But then even as we look, as more people are staying home, you would expect a surge in online shopping, but even internet purchases are dropping as well. Why is that happening?
So take a look, for example, at Best Buy. Best Buy has told us that their online sales have spiked over 250% this quarter compared to last year, the same time last year. However, their same-store sales are expected to be negative. And the reason being because in the United States, over 90% of total retail sales still happens at physical stores, at brick and mortars. So even though there's a spike of online shopping, it still is not making up for the fact of the sales that they could have had if the stores were open. The fact that there's so many consumers that are unemployed and holding back on spending, then you have the result of weak sales.
And as you mentioned, not just consumers unemployed, obviously a lot of these companies have had to cut back on their own retail staff. What is this doing for employment in the sector?
Well, it's interesting because the one economic indicator that consumers understand very well is the unemployment number, and it has the strongest correlation with consumer spending. So currently, millions of Americans have filed for unemployment, and those that are currently employed have a family member or friend that is unemployed. So therefore, they themselves are in fear of losing their jobs, and this is affecting consumer confidence, which is at very low numbers right now, and it's also causing for those that are employed to put their hands in their pockets in fear of losing their jobs.
And as we look at some of the shifts in consumer confidence, we saw the fourth biggest monthly drop in consumer confidence in 50 years in March. How is the pandemic really changing consumer behavior?
It's changing in so many ways, but for starters, the consumers that are at home are trying to make their experience very comfy, if you say so. And so much so that they are willing and able to pay full price for some items like robes and even socks and underwear and pajamas. Now, another change in behavior that we've seen is that the men are growing pandemic beards, and instead we're seeing that shaving revenue is expected to decline by 10% this quarter, whereas grooming products are selling out in twice the amount that they did last year. Then other changes that we're seeing is that for retailers, for one, it's definitely put a lot more pressure for them to invest in omni-channel, right? Because as consumers are home, they are ordering through their mobile phones or through their laptops, and then are decided to either have these items delivered to them or pick up by curbside. So the omni-channel experience has definitely become key and important for retailers to invest in.
And speaking of that, in terms of things like advertising, are retailers really taking notice of some of the changes in consumer behavior, and how is that really shifting their business strategies?
There's been so many shifts in strategy. For one, because consumers are so, the way they consume their information has been shifted mostly to mobile. It's a lot of that advertising has gone more towards social media as opposed to television, especially with a lot of consumers cutting the cords. We're also seeing that a lot of retailers are obviously furloughing their employees in order to save money. They're trying to spin off their real estate. And and as we mentioned before, the omni-channel experience, this investment in technology, is not cheap. It's a heavy duty one, so much so that even Target, who has now done a really good job in improving their omni-channel, is one of the winners right now. They actually got punished by Wall Street, by the market, for 5 long years because of their heavy investments in omni-channel, of how expensive this cost is, which is a necessary evil because now today that translates into stronger earnings.
So then, with this pandemic being such a shock across the board for all industries, what sort of wake-up call and perhaps opportunities do you think this experience can present for retailers?
Well, it's interesting because even for the winners, like you're talking about Target, Costco, and Walmart, they've had to increase their pay for the customers that are, working right now and putting their lives on the line, for these retailers to stay open. So there's definitely a lot of pressure on the retailers themselves. One thing they have shown us is they're not lazy about their survival. The department stores that have been most vulnerable right now are even, trying to reopen in a time when consumers don't want to go out, like Macy's is trying to reopen in many states here in the United States. So as you can see, it's day by day, it's uncharted territory, but consumers are working towards their survival.